That makes it easy. Well, before I get started, I wanted to tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from and do a favor to who's sending me here. My PhD is in mythological studies with an emphasis in depth psychology from Pacific Graduate Institute. And the reason I went through this graduate program is the same reason that I have so much appreciation and love for the Inklings, which is that I believe in a synergy of scholarship and storytelling and the study of myth for the making of myth. And for this reason, Tolkien and the Inklings have been iconic figures for me for a long time. So it's an honor to speak here, and it's an honor to be able to say to you that I'm part of a very special school where we are, if I can say this, making Inklings.
Hey, wait. We can't have these kind of production values.
I teach at a film and performing arts school that was started by this Relativity Media company. So I chair this general education department, Relativity School, which is a new film and performing arts school in Los Angeles Center Studios. When I first contacted them, what I said was that if they have to teach non-myth or non-film courses to filmmakers, they could do no better than mythology. Here's X, Y, Z. And they turned around and hired me to build it into the whole school and make an emphasis on storytelling across the board there. And that was 2 years ago.
Wow.
It's been very cool, and it's actually, we're graduating our first class this year. And it's been very fun. The students have really taken to it, and not just the filmmakers, also the actors, dancers, thespians. And they're all becoming story scholar storytellers. And this is why I'd like to say they're all becoming Inklings. So one of the reasons that I wanted to say that is because the school paid for me to come here. And I felt like that was only fair. But one of the things I also wanted to tell you is that Relativity School paid for me to come here. And the reason they did is because we, as a school, admire the synergy MythCon demonstrates between story as a study, as a craft, and as a source of participation. It's an honor to be here, a pleasure to speak here, and I can't wait to share this weekend with everybody. I've been wanting to come for years. Okay, enough introduction, enough service to my masters. I'll jump right in. So this presentation was actually really hard for me because the first several iterations, it just wasn't clicking. So the way I started was, I would be surprised if several others didn't start this way, finding digital copies of all the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit texts and whichever books we wanted to use, and then control-Fing every single one of the occurrences, going through and typing and categorizing and figuring out what are the consistencies showing up here. And some of the consistencies surprised me, and I was really, for example, one of the things is that gold, when presented as above, even in weird situations like a vaulted roof, tended to be a positive thing, whereas below, underfoot, it tended to be negative. And this, I later found, was related to this relationship between hoarding and flowing. So as I looked deeper and deeper into it, the more I started to find that when gold is hoarded, and this is conventional wisdom too, it's very negative, whereas when it's flowing generously, it's presented very positively. So I continued to dig in, but that still felt kind of boring to me, and really straightforward. Yesterday, finally, some things clicked, and I started to see that there isn't just this tension. There are narrative arcs built between these poles, between hoarding to flowing. And so that finally gave me a way into this presentation that wasn't so messy, chaotic, lost, and kind of dry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a certain set of narrative arcs that I see presenting hoarding and flowing, especially in the context of gold. So Smaug hoarding gold, of course, the Master of Lake Town hoarding gold, the dwarf love kind of generally for gold and the hoarding of gold. Thorin is the ultimate example of this. And then we'll look at Bilbo and how he participates in hoarding and flow. And this will lead ultimately into a look at the ring and the eye. But I should say most of my emphasis is on The Hobbit. I suspect many of you also came to kind of feel like between The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit puts a lot more emphasis on gold as and greed and hoarding, whereas it all gets kind of focused on the ring, which is a gold hoarded object and coveted object, but it's a little bit more distilled and focused on the ring in Lord of the Rings, whereas it's very clearly gold and just straight up hoarding gold in The Hobbit. So all along the way, what I want to show is that Tolkien has mythopoetically expressed an understanding of hoarded gold as an act of a corrupted soul that is defeated, healed, and or counterbalanced by some sort of unclinging, some sort of flow. Okay, so we'll start at the, come on, there we go. All right, always scared that the PowerPoint just won't work. So here's a good example. grew up on this movie.
What is it?
1977. So here's, of course, he's hoarding. Here's the gold underfoot. And we'll see Thor and again replace him with the gold underfoot, but we'll focus on Smaug. So Smaug's hoarding of gold is sung about, of course, by the dwarves setting up the Hobbit, setting up the adventure. And what they're singing, actually, they're not just singing that Smaug is hoarding their gold, they're singing of their lost hoard of gold. So they're already calling it a hoard before before Smaug has it. And so, but what we find is that they actually don't heal. The arc is not to regain their hoard. The arc is actually to trigger a flowing, and so we'll look. Here's an example of prophecy that's supposed to heal this whole situation.
Prophecy? Who's dragged up that old nonsense?
People, sire. The gathering in the streets, they're saying that a king will return to the lonely mountain, and that the rivers will once more run with gold.
Rivers of gold? Topping? Cock?
As you say, sire. But people will believe what they want to believe.
So of course here he
It's been a long
is
time
hoarding
since
gold,
we've seen any
also
riches.
in the same motif. We'll come back to him in the next slide.
Hope.
But the point is that the hoarding is supposed to be resolved by the flowing wealth from Erebor, and we'll continue to look at this with Thorin in a minute. And I don't think we should take the time to look at this. I don't remember it in the books, but in the movies, you'll remember that they melt down the gold and they defeat Smaug temporarily for the purpose of having closure in a second movie. They have to defeat him, but the way that they defeat him is consistent with this whole motif. The melting down of the gold and the flowing of the gold that surrogately defeats him for the purpose of closure in a second movie. So Smaug again, this whole curse of Smaug, and this is just another from the more recent movies. But the curse of Smaug is that he is hoarding, and the arc is that the wealth from Erebor should flow into Lake Town. And so we see it again with the master of Lake Town.
We're carrying too much weight.
We need to do something.
So he has the option of letting the rivers flow with gold, and instead he pushes off his attendant, right? Literally, he has the gold that he could have thrown away instead, but of course we're not fools. We know that his attendant is just as much of a hoarder as he is. Yeah, right, exactly. But I appreciate when the movies continue one of the themes or motifs, even if it's in a way that's original. So, when they go off the So, of course, what happens when a miser or a dragon who's been hoarding all the gold dies? It flows again. So, this is contrasted in the book when they describe, when Tolkien describes the old master as taking most of the gold, fleeing with it, and dying of starvation, whereas the new master, the wiser master, the prosperous master, literally again, this phrase is making the rivers run with gold. So again, this whole arc, there's this kind of meta arc between the hoarding and the flowing. And so now moving on to the dwarves. The dwarves are interesting because they're almost, I don't know if this is kind of a weird way to say it, but maybe the relationship between HIV to AIDS is comparable between the dwarf's greed for gold and dragon sickness full blown. They're already there. They already have this kind of latent, desire for gold. So in the heart of a dwarf, even the most respectable is wakened by gold and by jewels. He grows suddenly bold and he may become fierce.
For ancient king and elvish lord, there many a gleaming golden hoard they shaped and wrought, and light they caught, to hide in gems on hilt of sword. On silver necklaces they strung.
I would love to listen to this
Flower-
whole poem. But so here again, this is back to that song, and I've talked about it with Smaug. I've talked about it with the master of Lake Town, because this is really the main arc of the whole story, is this hoard that the dragon is guarding being unleashed and being allowed to flow. So the dwarves come in desiring the hoard. Actually, they even infect Bilbo with the desire for gold when he's listening. And again, the arc is suggested, the completion of the arc is suggested here.
I remember this town in the great days of old. Fleets of boats lay at harbour, filled with silks and fine gems. This was no forsaken town on a lake. This was the centre of all trade in the north. I would see those days return. I would relight the great forges of the dwarves and send wealth and riches flowing once more from the halls of Erebor.
Which is, of course, exactly opposite of what he's going to do, right? The second he gets control of this hoard, he is not letting anything flow from Erebor. So, I think it's interesting, though, that this and by the way, this is the stuff that would not have jumped out at me if I didn't just really search systematically between all the uses of gold to see where, the word flow just kept coming up, rivers just kept coming up, and you see it over and again. And so I thought it was interesting, too. Here, Gimli in Lord of the Rings, son of Glóin, your hands, this is given golden hair by an elf queen, and your hands shall flow with gold, and yet over you gold shall have no dominion. This is like the archetypal ideal character for Tolkien, are these characters who are not corrupted by the desire for gold or power or something like this, whether it's the ring with Bilbo and Frodo, that they're special, the hobbits are kind of resistant to this. Gimli, this excellent dwarf who is not susceptible to the same tendency of the dwarves. Tom Bombadil and Bjorn consistently just kind of like let it go. I think Bombadil even has the ring on his pinky finger at some point, doesn't even think twice about it, And so you see this repetition of not just flowing, but what stops flowing is clinging. So the unclinging is another side of this flowing motif. Okay, so shifting over now to the ultimate example of Thorin in The Hobbit. He is the kind of one who gets the most overtaken with dragon sickness, and so we'll see a couple examples of the coloring here.
Gold. Gold beyond measure. Beyond sorrow and grief. Behold, the great treasure hoard of Thor.
The great treasure
Welcome,
hoard.
my sister's sons, to the kingdom of Erebor.
You notice that when he says welcome to the kingdom, he's looking at the gold. Like for him, the kingdom is the hoard, is the gold. He's already starting to be taken over by this gold almost instantly. We won't look at all these examples. I like
The
to pull most
treasure
of
in this
them up,
mountain
but
does not belong to the people of Lake
this is
Town.
him starting to get more and more taken by the dragon sickness. More and more
It's ours.
hoarding.
And ours alone. By my life, I will not part with a single coin.
Oops. So we could show some more. Actually, this is one more that I really like. We'll do this one.
Don't underestimate the evil of gold. Gold over which a serpent has long brooded. Dragon sickness seeps into the hearts of all who come near this mountain. Almost all.
So we've established Thorin ultimately as example after example after example of him in this state of hoarding, this dragon sickness, this desire to keep the gold. And what I find so interesting is actually the ultimate example of him in the deepest state of dragon sickness is when he's clad in a coat of gold-plated rings. I think that's highly intentional. I think he's absolutely engaging the same thing as he's engaging with the ring, where the gold ring is this corrupting symbol. And so here is Thorin when he's in his most corrupted state wearing a coat of gold-plated rings. Later, however, he turns, of course. Eventually, in the end, he becomes willing to, when he's dying, he says, if more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. So he has an arc, he has a turn. He does come to come to regret his hoarding. And I don't know if we can show this. This is a long sequence, I think. But, I cut most of it out. But ultimately, when he's turning, his turn, when he finally turns, is to take off his crown, to toss it down.
And not my grandfather.
Is this treasure truly worth more than your honor?
I'm not my grandfather.
Notice the same imagery happens later when the orc goes underneath him in the ice. It's the same visual metaphors going on. This is Smeagol going into Mount Doom, right? One of the pair kind of dies. And off with the crown, this ring of gold. So Thorin, I think, displays this very clearly, where he has this hoarding nature and eventually he comes to regret it. And I thought this was just a nice little touch, definitely by the filmmakers, where the symbolic expression of his victory is letting go of the stone, tossing it away. The same moment you just saw throwing off the crown, this victory is the same. Same visual expression. Of course, into the flow of water. Okay, so I wanted to look at the wall because this isn't one of the kind of clearest versions of this whole motif. Here you have him building up a wall, ultimate symbol of hoarding and enclosure.
We must go to the gate!
And then the arc completed when it's the gold that bursts forth out of the castle and literally opens up the enclosure. Of course, they run across the water. Let's see, they had, this is the text. Part of the wall, moved by levers, fell outward with a crash into the pool. Out leapt the king under the mountain, and his companions followed him. Hood and cloak were gone. They were in shining armor. Red light leapt from their eyes. In the gloom, the great dwarf gleamed like gold in a dying fire. Okay, so I just thought that was a very, very simple little example of enclosure, and then breaking the enclosure as a little meta micro arc that's defining a major theme in this whole story. Okay, so we should shift over to Bilbo now. So Bilbo expresses this in a set of ways. One is, of course, that straightforward. I mean, he gets caught up in the dwarf's desire for gold himself. When they're singing the song, it's remarked by Tolkien mentions that Bilbo is seduced and also comes to feel the same desire that the dwarves feel. But what happens in the end? He returns with only so little. He actually is willing to give away the Arkenstone, his whole 14th share. So even though he started out with this seduction of this hoarding nature, he has this turn himself and does not become a hoarder. In fact, the beginning of the story, he's like really hoarding all of his stores. He doesn't want to give the dwarves the cheese and the ale and the beer and the wine or the liquor or the beer or the ale. And and of course at the end, at the very start of Fellowship of the Rings, Gandalf shows up and he's like, well, let's see. Let's play it.
You caught me a bit unprepared, I'm afraid.
Chicken, pickle, cheese. What can I get you? He's different. It's the start of The Hobbit. He's like, I don't want to share anything I got. Start of Lord of the Rings. He's like, what can I do for you? What can I give you? This is an inner arc of that same motif, hoarding versus flowing and sharing. The stores of Erebor are mimetic with the stores of Hobbiton. And you can see the same arc with the troll hoard, right? What happens when the dwarves and Bilbo find the hoarded troll treasure? They bury it deeper. They hoard it even more. But later in the story, Bilbo digs it up, but he only takes, so I think two bags that his pony can carry, only so little, and he spends most of it, Tolkien says, on gifts for his nephews and nieces. So he's shifted this hoarding nature that is attractive in this moment when the dwarves are singing the song is now totally experienced an arc. And but this of course sets up at the end of the story. Oh yeah, no, I like this moment. I'm going to play the video.
You take only 2 tiny bags of gold home with you? Your share was greater.
It's all my pony could carry, and it's more than I'll ever need.
But you have other prizes.
The ring? Oh, yes. I'll keep it as a souvenir, in a glass box on the mantel.
Ha!
And of course, we know where this goes, and this sets up a whole new arc of hoarding, the arc of hoarding and flow that will define Lord of the Rings. And so that's what I want to shift in now, but before so I want to note that of course, Bilbo will come to hoard the ring, and then giving it to Frodo. We all remember that scene, that powerful scene, how challenging it is to give that special thing up. And that is that same arc, the unclinging nature, the same unclinging nature in Gimli's hands when he lets the gold will flow without him grabbing to it. And this is what defines so many times the deepest qualities of characters for Tolkien. So let's look specifically at the ring now, and we're going to move on a little bit from The Hobbit. And just so you know, I'm going to try and end with a few minutes for questions. So of course the arc of the ring, we won't show all these videos, is that it is forged, and what does the ring do? And the darkness binds, right? So the ring is a symbol of binding. And I have this hunch, I have this feeling that there's actually where you go from hoarding to flowing is a dynamic arc. But you can see statically, I think that the ring is a static expression of enclosure of hoarding, right? Without time. So the ring isn't self-enclosed, it binds. I mean, even if you go back to the Cabiroi, the sacred mysteries of Prometheus and Hephaestus, they wore a ring that symbolized the bondage of Prometheus even after he was freed. So the ring is a symbol of bondage and binding. Even in Spanish, word for wife and handcuff is the same, esposa. So the ring that binds. But of course, what is the other side of the arc? The ring literally melts. And what happens, so you go from the bondage of Mount Doom to the flow of Mount Doom. So again, this arc. And then at the same time, the Eye of Sauron, which is repeatedly connected with the ring, whether it's this image right here that Tolkien drew, where it's every time the ring is touched, or most of the times the ring's touched, we see the eye, or Frodo does. This connection of the eye and the ring, I think, is actually very much related to the same symbol, the same visual geometry of enclosure. And so, of course, when the ring is melted and when the mountain flows, the Eye of Sauron also falls. And remember, back to this general idea that these things found in the depths and hoarded in the depths carry this negative quality. Of course, the ring is found hoarded by Gollum in the deepest depths. And then, of course, the arc of the ring is, instead of it being hoarded, it becomes delivered to the flowing mountain. And of course, then you have this arc. Those bound by the ring are freed. I shouldn't have put that there. These are just examples of characters that are kind of unclinging to the ring. So quickly, I've said this, that I think that the enclosure is a static expression of hoarding. And what I wanted to jump to was a couple examples in Western myth and Western consciousness that reinforce the same motif. And I think my suspicion is it was probably important to Tolkien. Some of you may have heard of the Ring of Gyges, which also has the power to make somebody invisible. It's found deep underground in the depths, and it's also used by Plato as the ultimate example of egoism by Thrasymachus and the Republic. This golden ring that symbolizes, that enables somebody to be invisible, is a symbol of egoism. I think is very much borrowed for Tolkien. That's my sense, my guess. But it's expressing the same thing. And I actually think that Tolkien was very much in line with Plato on this. That Plato, like the Heraclitus, Pythagoras, Socrates before him, was very much an ascetic. He believed in non-clinging. He believed in not being attached to the dross of the fallen material world. And so I think that the same philosophy is coming through in the idea of the ring and of the gold, to not be taken over by this desire to hoard, by the power of the material world to corrupt. to be somewhat of an ascetic who's uninfluenced. And of course, this is consistent with basic Christianity, where Christians are supposed to be willing to let go of their material needs and desires. Get rid of all your riches and follow Christ. They're supposed to empty themselves of their individual spirit to allow themselves to be filled with the Holy Spirit. And of course, the ultimate symbol of Christ's resurrection is literally escaping imprisonment, rolling away the stone, emptying the tomb. And I think this is the same idea, this emptying of this relationship with materiality, with not just, well, actually, that's going to take me down a road. I mean to stay on gold and not get into materialism at large. But I do think this is important because I tend to think that that altogether Tolkien's work is a continuation of Christian classical and Western thought, specifically Plato's, insofar as all three provide clear examples in which enclosure and hoarding, especially in the context of material wealth, is seen as the activity of a corrupted soul, whereas ideal Platonists, Christians, and the characters of Tolkien are defined by their freedom and or overcoming of the desire to cling and hoard. So as opposed to expressing this didactically, this worldview of Tolkien's comes through in the very texture of his work, which is exactly what I love so much about him. He has this tremendous mythopoetic ability to express his way of seeing through the consistent nuances of his imagery and narratives, as opposed to obnoxious didactic philosophizing. So statically, he makes golden rings and enclosures his ultimate expression of hoarding and clinging. Similarly, he puts enchanted gold under the hoarding feet of Smaug and Thorin. Dynamically, he gives us narrative arc after narrative arc in which the hoarded comes to flow. Static rings come to melt, and those with dragon sickness come to flow with generosity. Thanks. And I guess do I have a few minutes for questions? Yeah, please.
Well, one passage that just came to my mind as you were speaking concerning Bilbo. After the party, they're going through. Somebody says, what happened to all of Bilbo's gold? Everybody's saying that he the treasure. What happened? And Frodo says he gave it away. He didn't feel that it was really his because it came from robbers. And I think that's sort of a counterpoint to what you were saying. I don't think it quite fits with what you're saying, but it might be an interesting thing for you to look at and see how it might.
Yeah, that's interesting.
He didn't feel it belonged to him because it came from robbers.
See, and I don't think that stopped Smaug from thinking that gold belonged to him.
Well, exactly.
And I think actually earlier, what sets up the counterbalance with that is that he says that all of his relatives think that he's sitting on a hoard of gold. They think he has all this gold, so they're projecting this hoarding nature into him, whereas he is really like Gimli. He's not clinging to the gold. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Right there.
Yeah, early on, you alluded to Tom Bombadil in talking about how he wasn't bound by the gold ring. But of course, if he's bound by anything, it's Goldberry, the River's Daughter. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, although you don't have any Peter Jacksons.
No, it's so true. I have. I went through all the Goldberry sections, and I can't remember what I dug out of it. I eventually decided I couldn't work it in and haven't been playing with it for a while now. But I appreciate you bringing that up, and I got to admit I probably can't give a really solid, strong answer in response. But it is interesting that that if he is attached to anything, it's probably his love.
Flowing River's Daughter.
Yeah, flowing.
Yeah.
Oh.
River's Daughter.
Right.
River's Daughter.
I should have brought a pen up here myself. Was there one more? Yeah, please.
What would you say is do you want this?
Oh, I will in a second.
Anyway, what would you say would be the difference between what you're talking about and the way that Gandalf and Galadriel and Elrond do hang on to rings?
They do, but Galadriel and Gandalf both refuse the ring when offered to them, which I find. I think that there's definitely two sides here. We're not supposed to believe these characters are perfect and perfectly, like never sin Jesus-like characters. But at the same time, we are supposed to recognize them as really close to the type of ideal characters of Tolkien, which are characters that, when presented with the ring, are able to say no. But at the same time, maybe that's an arc for them.
Or
maybe they said yes at first, and now they're saying no.
Or could it be because they use them for others?
For others. I think, I don't know. I've never been sure on...
But in the end, they are hanging on to rings.
They absolutely are. And I'm not... That's a really good question. I think I'm just going to have to meditate on that. But I would like to think that maybe there's an arc between originally they accept the rings, become bound by the rings, and then it's a true show of their character. They should want the rings more